In the first episode of this series, we spoke about the variety in people's reactions to the pandemic. We also mentioned that this variety is largely due to differences in personality. The risk type compass is a psychometric measure of risk personality, which places everybody into one of 8 risk types. Your position on the compass relates to how you perceive, process, and react to risk, as well as how these things influence the way you make decisions. Those with similar positions on the compass will react in a similar way, while those further away from each other will react distinctly differently. In this episode of our webinar series, we're again going to compare 2 polar opposite risk types, drawing a vertical line down the middle of the compass from top to bottom. We examine how people at various points up and down that line might be expected to experience the risk and uncertainties of COVID-19, how they think and how they feel about the events that we were all overtaken by. The pair of risk types that are opposite ends of that line are the wary risk type and the adventurous risk type. We will also be looking at some of the findings from our recent research into how different risk types reacted to COVID-19. This time, the continuum of risk dispositions that we explore is a composite of both emotion and cognition, the 2 underlying measures that underpin the risk type compass. Decision making involves both, and in today's discussion, we're concerned with the interaction between the 2, how the chemistry of this combination influences risk dispositions. Starting with the wary risk type at the top of the compass, they combine 2 kinds of risk aversion. They're doubly risk averse because they are more fearful than most, but they're also risk averse in the sense that they're distressed by uncertainty. They need to know to make sense of what's going on around them, and they'll do everything they can to eliminate uncertainty. Similarly, their polar opposite, the adventurous risk type, has 2 reasons to be risk-taking. Firstly, at the extreme, they're characterized by fearlessness, and secondly, they have little problem with uncertainty. In fact, they welcome it. All of which releases them to become a fluid and intrepid explorer of limits, boundaries, and the unknown. On one end of this continuum then, you have the wary risk types, high on emotion and cognition, and the chemistry between them both. They're the most risk-averse of all risk types, and their highly sensitive risk antennae pick up on any hint of threat or uncertainty. The experience of these vulnerabilities drives a shrewd and persistent skepticism and a highly structured approach to life within which everything is clearly labelled and has its place, restraining any adventurous impulses. They're cautious, tough on themselves, and mistrustful of the feasibility of others. They're strategically organised and well informed so that they can protect themselves by being cautious and prudent. Their distress about ambiguities or uncertainties creates a scenario in which emotion turbocharges their need for certainty. Add to these a reluctance to rely on others, and that in turn drives a determination to take control of things for themselves. With predictability and security at the top of their agenda, their ardent desire for a risk-free future combined with an almost insatiable need for reassurance, may leave them chasing an unattainable ideal, preferring to take charge for themselves and to maintain control of events. Their passion and determination make them a formidable influence. Their opposite risk type is adventurous. At the root of their risk dispositions is a combination of gung-ho impulsivity and fearlessness. These individuals are excited by novelty and new ideas, and they're persistent in their belief that nothing is impossible. Their calm and level-headed approach means that they're more likely to be excited by the unexpected than to be perturbed by it. They're likely to adapt well to change, and they're intrepid and never discouraged, so they can quickly rebound from any setback, and they have no desire to dwell on past mistakes. These individuals are unafraid of failure, and when things do go pear-shaped, Undaunted, they sort themselves out and prepare to get back into the fray and start all over again. However, their enthusiasm and dismissive optimism or casual evaluation of worst case scenarios makes for an all or nothing sort of approach. And all this impetuosity may strike back in the form of repetition of past mistakes. They may also misjudge the concerns of others, their caution or reticence, and their preference for a more restrained approach. At a general level, this risk type is resilient and attracted by excitement. Open to new experiences, their positive and upbeat outlook means that they're drawn towards stimulating challenges and they're prepared to countenance radical alternatives that will open up new possibilities. Sort of conversely to that, being the risk-averse risk type, COVID-19 would likely present a greater challenge and engender greater levels of tension and distress for the wary risk types than it would for any other group. Firstly, they're concerned about insecurity, danger, and vulnerability. In short, they're intensely focused on safety and survival. Wary risk types would certainly be expected to be amongst the most fearful about contagion, being worried about being near others and contracting the infection, but this is also part of their self-discipline and compliance, features that come from the prudent aspect of their risk disposition. Secondly, they're also troubled by all the ambiguity and uncertainty associated with COVID-19. The inconsistencies, for example, about whether the science does or does not say that wearing a mask is beneficial or indeed essential, or what size a bubble should be, whether or not children with minor symptoms transmit the virus, and so on. Not being able to work out what's going on as the story of the virus gradually and frustratingly revealed itself increment by increment is a second source of anguish. This combination makes risk exposure particularly distressing to them because their own instincts are in perpetual conflict, wanting desperately to do the right thing, but struggling with the incoherence of messaging. The intensity of their emotional life and the disquiet and discomfort of not being able to understand what's happening create a situation that is potentially very stressful and hard to bear. Some will have locked themselves down long before being instructed to do so, in despair of achieving any other kind of consistency and certainty. In line with our expectations, PCL's research showed that wary risk types found reading about the impact of the virus to be emotional. Being emotionally sensitive individuals, the emotional component of stories around the coronavirus stood out for them. There's no necessity in their case for the hard-hitting emotional messaging that's been recommended by the behavioural scientists in their attempt to increase the sense of threat and instigate social disapproval. The PCL survey confirms their devotion to compliance, following procedures and the latest information. This made them attentive to the announcements, but as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, they would have awaited each unpredictable announcement with increasing apprehension. Wary risk types were also found to often contemplate who's to blame for the impact of the virus. This is perhaps an expression of, I'm doing my bit, who hasn't been doing theirs? Sort of, it's not my fault, so whose fault is it? Now, paradoxically, this is a reflection of a tendency to be self-critical and very demanding of themselves. The need to absolve themselves of responsibility reflects their own self-doubts and self-criticisms and reluctance to take on any additional burdens of guilt. Asking who is to blame is also an attempt to reduce the uncertainties about the pandemic. It seems that they had also become more organised in ways unrelated to the virus, because while they could gather information on the pandemic, it remained out of their control. To gain a feeling of control within their lives, they structured elements of daily life unrelated to the virus. Now, by contrast, the adventurous risk types are the most risk tolerant and resilient. Firstly, they're impulsive and have a disregard for the conventional. And secondly, they're imperturbable and seemingly oblivious to risk. At the start of the pandemic, adventurous risk types were expected to be frustrated by restrictions, not wanting to be told what they can and cannot do. Being calm about the impact of the virus, as well as having a disregard for custom, they were expected to be optimistic with a sort of all will turn out well in the end approach. Adventurous risk types were found to be more optimistic than most when looking ahead to the next few months. Their calmness and optimism diminished the potential risks ahead, and this outlook caused them to be oblivious to the possibility of negative outcomes for themselves. Instead, their vision of the coming months was optimistic. Their belief was that this will all be over soon enough. They also remained skeptical about the seriousness of the epidemic longer than most. This skeptical approach meant that they did not immediately adopt the safety measures being put in place. Instead, they took charge of their own destiny and insisted on carrying on with life as normal. Being the most risk tolerant, they did not see the early signs of the pandemic as anything to worry about. As others would have started to panic and prepare for the worst, adventurous risk types saw that response to be sort of a fuss about nothing. Once again, I hope that we have made the case that people cannot be herded. Human diversity is probably our greatest asset, especially at times of crisis. Risk types complement each other and make us more resilient as a species. Any attempt to ameliorate the pressures of the pandemic or any other threat needs to recognize this reality, working with nature rather than cutting across it. Don't miss the next exciting installment of the For Pandemic series. In the next episode, we'll be looking at the excitable and deliberate risk types. And if you can't wait until then to find out more about the risk type compass, then please do get in touch. We're always happy to talk about all things risk type.